In Runescape, combat has gone through many shifts, most notoriously the evolution of combat update, where combat went from simple point and click to complicated ability interactions, resource management, and rotations. This system evolved over a decade for players to refine and master. But as this mastery over the system grew, the average player got left behind.
Necromancy is a new skill for Runescape and a new standalone combat style.
Necromancy. Jagex attempt to fix combat.
Necromancy is a non-elite new combat skill that goes up to level 120, and for free-to-play it goes up to level 20.
It's the first new combat style ever released in RuneScape.
But first, let's look at how combat works in RuneScape to understand how it should be fixed. RuneScape doesn't follow the Holy Trinity, and instead is more free-flowing, and allows everyone to bring whatever gear they decide to a fight. Roles during boss fights are more mechanical in terms of who deals with what mechanics or buffs. Tanking is still a relevant role in the game, but this is done mostly with DPS gear and refers to the player the boss is aggro to, as they will have mechanical responsibilities like moving the boss to a desired location. Every player has access to sustain and a couple of support spells. These can be used mainly to use your own HP to heal a teammate, or redirect teammates' damage to you. Adrenaline is the main resource used during combat, and managing it is a core skill. Basics generate adrenaline that can be used for thresholds, ultimates, and special attacks. There's 3 types of ultimates: damage buffs, crit buffs, and big ass hits. The game runs on a 1.8 second global cooldown, and each ability has a unique cooldown. The main survivability comes from switching between soul split to heal the player whilst doing damage, and protection prayers to reduce damage taken when taking hits. Players can also eat food or use defensive abilities to maintain HP, but this comes at a cost of adrenaline or inventory space. Auto attacks and spells can be weaved in sometimes, as they run on a separate timer. Ammo, spells, weapons and armor can all be swapped mid-combat for the player's benefit. Sometimes swapping a single piece situationally, or sometimes swapping to a whole other combat style.
The reason why RuneScape is so complex at the endgame now, it started off simple with EOCs, but the RuneScape community grew with that. And then the baseline moved, so we got a little bit more complex. Yes. And because things are released at the endgame, the progression curve of brand new player would hopefully, it does follow that learning as well. So that layer of complexity and teach a little bit more, learn how that thing works.
I think it's common knowledge that optimally a good combat system would have a low skill floor for ease of entry and a high skill ceiling to keep the players interested over time. RuneScape had a janky high skill floor, and the complexities of the ability interactions, rotations, and good practices are not explained in the game in any interactive way. These can be found on outside resources such as PvMe, but this requires the player to have access to the community. The remedy to this is to simplify the skill floor.
If combat's something you'd like to do more of, but at the moment you find the barrier to entry is a bit high for the existing styles, then Necromancy is a perfect way to actually get started.
So how did the community react to the release? The release of Necro was a huge success to the masses. Necromancy brought immediate power to newer players and made combat extremely accessible. It's great for beginners, and having only 3 basics to choose from makes rotations a lot simpler. Some of the new Necro abilities are quite interesting, such as Death Skulls, which is a bouncing ball that does damage while jumping between targets, and it can also use the player as a bouncing point. You can use this in interesting ways, such as transferring the ability from faraway targets using a precise movement ability during the bounces. Stack-based systems and abilities are easy to understand and follow. This is especially good for streamers, where seeing what a Necroer is doing is very easy.
On the other hand, for players who take a more active approach to combat, Necromancy will reward you for your skill and your knowledge and your activity.
The style is ass.
True.
I want back to mage range.
The content from Jagex was extremely condescending during this period, and I can't find any WOTs from them. Necromancy fixed the skill floor for itself, but is very limited on the higher end, effectively capping the skill ceiling on it. Necro tried to remove stalling, which means storing an ability to be used later. You can't use any other abilities between, but it's useful at the start of fights, between phases, or when DPS checks require burst. On top of this, Jagex in their infinite wisdom removed cross-style crit buffs, a key high-level strategy used in other styles, causing community outrage.
Question in chat about skill bars, you've got 15. Make room. You're not using ranged, make room. You're not using melee, make room, come on.
Yeah, I mean,
if I don't use 15, you don't need to use 15.
So why do I hate Necro so much? Reduced variance allows for less situational skill expression, and there's not much to do between abilities, which leads to a boring, monotone gameplay loop. This has also enabled full-blown PvM bots, as every kill with Necro can be the same. On top of this, Necromancy is too easy to do too much damage with, whilst not teaching or requiring valuable skills needed for other combat styles. This leads to an incentive trap, where new players have no reason to ever use anything else. And worst of all, the minions that should be the main focus of Necromancy are boring, and Ghost just breaks the game completely. What do I mean by breaks the game completely? Command Ghost makes your target take 20 to 20% more damage. On top of this, the Ghost heals the player for 800 to 1000 HP every 4.2 seconds, which is roughly 10% of your maximum HP. And if that wasn't enough, all of this is entirely passive, requiring one input before a fight.
But how do you manage defensive abilities?
No, defensives, they're my personal biggest gripe with the game. They've been too strong from the get-go. If we weren't to do something about them, then it's the same formula for every single boss. A attack comes out, a player will do Disruption Shield and completely nullify that. A attack comes out, a player will use Resonance and they will fully heal and mitigate the entirety of the damage. A big set of attacks comes out, a player will just pop on Barricade and that's it. They've got 18 seconds of invincibility, right? We have to start thinking about this.
But Necro didn't stop there. The passive healing wasn't enough. It also introduced Bone Shield. It removes the need to switch to a shield when using defensives. This was added to every single style and is not an exclusive to Necro. However, it is situationally game-breaking. Shields always held a place in the game as a swap for defensive power, but in exchange, when your defensive that required a shield was active, your DPS would be cut. This dichotomy kept shields and defensives somewhat in check. Defensives can now be used without most of their downside, adding to this survivability power creep. Someone at the Jagex office must have looked at this and went, "Oh, this makes players a bit tanky. For the next improvement, what if we made them even tankier?" Then they pumped out Darkness, a free 20% dodge chance applied to the player with a 12-minute uptime, the only downside being forgetting to use it. So how does Necromancy actually work in combat? First, you summon your minions and use Split Soul to turn Soul Split healing into damage. Then you precast your skeleton so it's ready to hit hard when the fight starts. Use Skulls, build to an ultimate which reduces Skulls cooldown, and use Skulls as much as possible. Basics build stacks for Finger and Volley. Use them when the stacks are ready. Use Bloat if needed. Don't worry about your HP.
Release me!
Let's look at range combat for comparison. First, Stall Tsunami, a magic ultimate at Wars for a crit buff. Release the stall at a dummy to start the pre-fight building up to damage boosting ultimate. Activate bulk special attack and build when stacks up to amplify damage for a burst window. Start the fight with Split Soul, then stall and release Serene Godbow with Rapid Fire, which gives an additional crit buff up to 4 abilities after it. Use Darkbow special attacks, Greater Ricochet and Snapshot, then the range crit buff to prepare for the next damage window and the same previous buffs. Both of these examples are simplified, but you can clearly see a lot more happens with range, and I didn't really explain every nuance of the input. Both styles have deliberate sort of set in stone rotations, but range feels more involved to use and has more options to deviate.
The one takeaway from being a RuneScape developer, and especially working on boss encounters, never underestimate RuneScape players. Because you will give them a door and say, hey, this is how the mechanic is intended to be done, and they will find every other way possible to go around, under, over, not through that door.
Necro has had an interesting impact in so-called prestige kills, where feats of survivability have been trivialized to the point of absurdity. However, kill speeds haven't really moved with Necro, since Necro isn't the best DPS outside of places requiring massive AoE. However, the average kill speeds have gotten faster, as this has raised the floor so substantially. This created a new breed of Necro-only high-end players with very limited ability outside of the Necro system, using it as a crux. And I think the big issue with this is that any new update that comes into the game has to be balanced around Necro.
Even though necromancy is a combat skill, if you don't want to engage with combat at all, you will still be able to level it out of combat using rituals.
But with the upgrade system that we have, you'll be able to upgrade your way through the tiers all the way to tier 90 by doing necromancy narrative story content. After level 90 is the standard set of affair in terms of PVM equipment. So for level 95 will drop from the first necromancer boss.
Necro completely destroyed the PVM economy. The best thing to buy for every new player is always Necro. The Necro items are easy to get for best in slot, and you get gifted powerful gear for free. You only need to do one easy boss and a couple of small upgrades after that. New players won't buy other styles as they are more expensive and harder to use. And the entire market for PVM items has crashed, as the Necro items were so easy to get. This also means that PVM progression has lost its meaning.
It was fundamental to us to make sure the necromancy was designed based on learnings from the past and built for the future.
We've got new bosses, we've got new goodies, and ultimately, players get to become a powerful, badass necromancer.
Necro's simplified version of the game has some merit to it. I like to PVM with friends who aren't as skilled at the game. I like to engage with a larger PVM community. The big issue is trying to get them to move on from Necro to engage with the entire combat system. Is there any hope? Can necromancy be fixed? First of all, delete the ghost. Tunnel snap it out of existence. Its current version doesn't need to exist. In this you could add interest to the minions to make them more meaningful, as currently they are barely noticeable. My suggestion is to only have 2 minions active, but have them have a wider skill set, specialized in different aspects of the game. You could have one for damage, another for AoE, one for healing and tanking, and one for support. This would enable meaningful playstyles inside Necro, and progression with the minion usage toward the other styles when the player becomes skilled enough. My third suggestion is to add a crit buff, so you could opt into hybriding with Necro. This would give high level players more options to play around with, and people improving with necromancy a way to branch out to other styles. This should be added carefully though, as to not break balancing too much. So what would you do? How would you fix Necro?